Hello, you are listening to an archived worship service of First Presbyterian Church, Columbus, Mississippi. Thank you for listening.
So I think we all have one of those friends. We all have one of those friends, maybe it was a college buddy or somebody that you know who just can't get out of their own way. They sabotage themselves over and over and over again. I've got this friend from college. He's still single at 41, and you know why? Because he's afraid. He's scared to death that some girl is going to find his flaw, his fault, and so after just a couple months, he will end the relationship. He'll look for something. He'll find what he's looking for, and the next thing you know, he's calling me saying, well, she's gone. I guess I'll have to find a new girlfriend. And it's not just that. We all know these people who do these things at work. They find something wrong with their livelihood, something wrong with where they live, something wrong with where they go to church, something wrong with their work life, and they sabotage it. They find something wrong, and they go looking for it until they find it. Fear of loss manipulates us in really, really strange ways. And we've all seen it, whether it's in ourselves, or sometimes it's easier to see when it's in others. But fear can cause us to do some really strange things. Today our passage begins with this really ominous phrase. When you see this phrase throughout history books and throughout the Gospels or Old Testament, you know something is about to happen. Isaiah starts off his call story with saying, in the year that King Uzziah died, you knew something was about to take place. When we begin the Gospels, it's and Herod is now the king of the land. You know something is about to happen. And so our author today begins this portion of our story saying there is a new king over Egypt. And you just know through that line, that ominous line, that something is about to change. And this is not something that has traditionally been very good change. Unlike our time where leadership is passed over without militaries marching, that wasn't the case in history past. The things that are about to change are not always very peaceful. The new king coming into power meant that there would be chaos, there would be confusion, there would be new rules to follow, there would be old rules that would go away. So in these very few words, you can hear all of Egypt take a deep breath, scared of what is about to happen. And all of a sudden you know where that fear and anxiety will be placed. Now there was a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Does that sound like words that are going to be good for God's people? Now, a quick reminder for those of us who, kind of like Pharaoh, need to remember who Joseph is. Joseph, son of Jacob, son of Isaac, son of Abraham, child of the promise. Joseph, loved by his father, gifted by God in dream and prophecy, tormented by his brothers, sold into slavery, his coat of many colors torn. But Joseph, through God's gift of dream and prophecy, rightly predicted the famine and saved the whole of Egypt and his own family from starvation and death. He was the superhero of his day until he was forgotten. And now there was a new king who did not know Joseph. There was a change, and there was a lack of institutional memory, as we would put it today. The new Pharaoh does not look at the children of Abraham with gratitude and mutual respect for their survival of the great famine. Now he looks out upon the fields and he sees a threat, a matter of national security, a risk to his power. His inability to remember will cause him to fear. Look how he lays out his fear. There's so many of them, and they're so big, and they're so strong, and they could betray us, they might destabilize us, and they possibly could join our enemies. Boy, did you hear all that fear? The mights, the coulds, the maybes? By giving it voice, he makes it real. And he says, I know what to do. Let's get rid of them. The fear of loss makes an enemy where a friend once stood. Fear. Fear of assumptions, fear of possibilities make life bitter and oppressive, and it becomes a poison even to his own community. Fear of loss sets the chessboard for Pharaoh in this competitive game theory where one side must lose so another side can win, even though they both have won in the past. These sides don't actually exist, you see. They're only in Pharaoh's mind. It's only in his mind that he's created these divisions between them. Fear tells him that he must beat them before they hear the whispers of fear in their own ears and paint him with the same brush that he's using. He's got to act first, or he may not get a chance to act later. If he waits to see if they are indeed his enemy, it'll be too late to make them his own enemy before they actually are. How often are we enemy creators? How often are enemies created out of fear, out of saber rattling, out of self-protectionism and self-preservation, with the idea that for us to win, somebody else has to lose? How often are enemies created when we push them away or build walls between ourselves or lob the first volley so we don't get hurt, so our family doesn't get hurt, so our community doesn't get hurt, so our nation doesn't get hurt? How proficient we are at creating enemies. How often do we let our anxieties and our fears tell us to act first and to think later? In our home life, in our work life, in our community life, in our national expectations, they're all susceptible to this fear of loss. But the fear of loss can't really do a whole lot until we add power to it. In Pharaoh's case, the fear mingled with his limitless power will come to a horrific end. One that will echo through the centuries and find new life again when the Christ child flees. That fear mingled with limitless power will become a horror in the world unless we meet Sapphira and Puah. Their names in Aramaic mean beautiful and splendid. Sapphira, Puah, beautiful, splendid. The king imposes his fear on others for them to carry out his despicable plan. But it is in these two women, these brave two women, that we glimpse how a world can overcome its suspicions, its anxieties, and its enemy-creating ways. How these two brave people can confront fear mingled with power. Fear of loss, fear of death. Fear of Pharaoh's power melts away in the life of these two women, in their testimony to something else, the light of God. Now, verse 17 puts it like this: the midwives feared God. Put a check in that. Which leads them to disregard Pharaoh, to see children live. Now that phrase that we put a check mark in, that fear of God, that carries with it a great many of images in our mind. Now sometimes you'll hear that phrase posed when someone says, I had to put the fear of God in them. I have put the fear of God in my own children when we're standing on a cliff and they're looking like they're about to jump off. I've had to do that. That's what we call that. But there's also the image of the fear of God that predominated the whole of Christian history. This idea that fearing God left you alive. Fearing something else other than the fears of the world just swapped out one fear for another. It can become a tool of the church, of some governments, in fact, over the millennia, to keep people in line. You should be afraid of your Maker. 500 years ago, there was a monk who lived in Germany who lived in constant fear of his Maker. In fact, in his many writings, he would write that he was so afraid of God that every time he preached, he was afraid that one slip of a word would mean that God would come down from the altar and consume him there in the pulpit. That was the fear that he lived with, and the fear that he gave to his congregation. You need to be afraid of your Maker. You need to fear a God. And fear of God can lead to some really, really awful things too. When we swap out one fear for another with limitless power. But it dawned on that monk there in Germany one day that this is not a God that we should be afraid of. If we are to take truth from the gospel of Jesus Christ, if we should understand in any way of anything that we should know about God, is God loves us, creates us, saves us. That this God who we have feared is also the one who will redeem us. And not only that, came to us enfleshed to lead us home. In that recognition, Martin Luther understood for the first time that God was not going to jump out and consume him in fire and ash. But the love of God would embolden him to do amazing things. And that was the message he would preach to his congregation, and other congregations in his writing around the world would change the whole of the church. The whole of the church would come to see God, not as something to be afraid of, but something to love. He took the example of beautiful and splendid. Their fear of God was not the fear exchanged for Pharaoh. It was a fear that creates an image of awe, one that will give life, not death. True fear of God is to be awashed with an experience of God's grace and extend that grace to others, not to quibble in fear of making a misstep or hiding ourselves away from others or pushing others away, because then we've just exchanged one fear in the world for another. Fear of God causes us to live, causes us to extend beyond our fear of loss, and it causes us to go out into our families, in our neighborhoods, in our places of work with mutual respect and love. That's not the same thing as Pharaoh's fear. But the fear of God is what fueled the midwives. They could not see an enemy where God had created reconciliation and abiding love. And you know what? Neither can we. When we take seriously the gospel of Jesus Christ, we cannot fall into the trappings of Pharaoh. Each day and every moment, we hear that ringing bell of fear of loss. Fear of loss. Fear of loss. But the women offer us a better example. They risk their lives. They question the fear of loss, of enemy making, to bring something better into the world. And we follow where their beautiful and splendid feet have trod, and we do the same. We must question. We must question enemy making in every form of our life. Whether it's pushing people away before they have the chance to push us away, whether it's doing something at work to gain at another person's expense, or whether it's saber rattling on a national scale. We must question what it is within us that longs to make enemies, that longs to follow in the footsteps of Pharaoh. And we must defy it, even at great risk, even unto death. That's no less than the midwives risked. We must question it. We must defy it with all of its horrible consequences. Today, let us walk in the ways of Sapphira and Puah. Let us cast aside the fear that Pharaoh feels. Let's cast aside our assumptions and the ways that we want to safeguard ourselves. Let us walk in a way that generations after will call upon our faith in God as beautiful and splendid. Amen.